Hey everybody, what is up? And what I'm going to do in this video is ask an interesting question. And the question is, should you trust science less? Now, the disclaimer I need to say first is please at least understand the point I'm trying to make before responding. I know there are going to be people in the comments, and it's going to be very clear to me that people that haven't actually heard what I'm saying or my main thesis, they're just going to think that I'm anti-science. So at least hear me out first, and then I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. Because there are certainly many groups I think need to trust the results of science or scientific consensus more, and that includes people like anti-vaxxers, people who deny climate change, these sorts of things. That's not what I'm going after. That's not who I'm aiming at this group. I am a science educator. I teach mostly undergraduate, some graduate classes in science and engineering, and I have published work in scientific journals and conferences. So I feel like I have the authority to talk about this a little bit and hopefully explore some of these issues. So the people I'm really addressing are mostly the science worshipers or people outside of the scientific community. And these are the sort of people that use science. You can kind of tell they're doing this because they're using science as this personification, like, oh, science says this sort of thing, like science makes proclamation, these sorts of things. And then they blindly trust findings that agree with their presupposed notions of the world and then dismiss those that aren't. So it's like, only good science is what supports my presupposed view, and what's bad science is what I don't agree with, even though I haven't actually looked into the evidence for both sides. And as a result, perhaps unsurprisingly, these are the people that misunderstand scientific methodology and what even defines science. Now, if I say you should trust science less, that means I need, some at least definition of science. And I'll talk about this in a second. So basically, the main point, and this is just kind of a goofy picture, but really the point of the scientific method is you ask a question and you do some research, and then eventually allows you to construct a hypothesis which you can test that either confirms or fails to reject your hypothesis, and then you continue iterating on this process until you publish a paper, and then other people publish papers either reconfirming your results, otherwise, and then, over here is kind of a joke, but the science worshipper's mission is you don't ask any questions, and you construct a model based on your preconceived ideas, and you find data that agrees with the model. This is not how science is done. This is not invoking the sort of Popperian falsifiability, and yeah, I guess that's just kind of what I want to say going about. Now, I think we have good reasons to trust the scientific method and the results of what is, confirmed by the scientific method. Because one of the ways the scientific method works, and there are a lot of philosophical assumptions here, but I'll go into that in another video. But imagine you take multiple buildings, and each of these could be your hypothesis. And what you do is you take each one and you sort of shake it, you test it, or you subject it to some sort of stress. And what this allows you to do is find which one is the sturdiest. If it is not able to be subjected to multiple types of tests, probably not a good theory, probably not a good hypothesis, and it falls away. And those buildings that withstand repeated attempts at falsification or tests, this is Popper's idea, are probably good ones, good theories, good models that you can trust more confidently in that sort of sense. So I'd argue the scientific method is a reliable and trustworthy way of choosing between competing theories or evaluating a hypothesis. Once again, ideas that hold up to different independent repeated tests of falsification are thus more reliable or in some ways scientifically mature. That's one way we like to say it. And, my claim would be we're justified trusting scientific results that have been repeatedly shown to hold. Now, there are philosophical assumptions here, but in the first place, I think that's a fair, pragmatic way to live your life. And as David Hume says, a wise man apportions his beliefs to the evidence. And in a similar way, scientific theories or in fields that are easy to test, you're going to have more confidence in those particular theories or in those particular fields where the theories are able to be tested more than in others. Now, there are two issues in actual the scientific community, and this is an issue that we as scientific researchers need to address. This isn't an issue that the public needs to address, but we need to address in order for us to be able to ask for the public's trust in science. Now, the first issue is a reproducibility crisis. This is not a new thing, but part of the problem is funding for repeating experiments or repeatedly testing a theory is difficult to obtain. And part of the reason for this is us researchers were really incentivized to come up with new ideas. You don't get a PhD for just reconfirming someone else's results. You're always expected to do something new and something novel. But the problem is this means you can base your experiment off of other people's results that may not be as solid or may not be as tested in different circumstances. And as a result, you're maybe not as confident. Now, it's not that black and white, but that is one particular issue that's going on. And sometimes even when replication is attempted, it's not always successful, which leads to what people call the reproducibility crisis, that we have all these theories and models, but we're not able to reproduce any of them, and therefore we can't trust these results, which is really tricky. And part of the problem is what happens is researchers will attempt to do some new theory, assuming that another theory has been tested and reproduced. And then what they end up finding is that it was no issue with their methodology, it was an issue with the assumption that they were basing their experiment on, which was based on someone else's experiment, but was very shaky or had some other assumptions. And then it's difficult to publish a paper that's kind of saying that someone else's theory is wrong in a particular way, in the same way as coming up with a new theory, even though there are a lot of journals that will accept, hey, we need to add nuance to this theory, and this is why this thing has been wrong. And eventually I think it converges, but for now, a lot of these new ideas that aren't mature aren't subjected to reproducibility, and in many cases it becomes difficult for the public to understand which theories are more scientifically mature and not. And part of the problem too is that a lot of redoing experiments, and they require access to data or code, expensive equipment, materials that are difficult or maybe even illegal to obtain. And as a result, we can't even trust individual people to be able to sort of verify the results of many scientific experiments. And as a result, in many ways, we're asking them to blindly trust our findings. We're not just asking them to trust the methodology of science, but we're asking them to trust that we are actually following this methodology correctly. And in some cases, unfortunately, we're asking them to trust us on a faith that maybe they shouldn't have, or they may not know how much faith to put in this process when we're just kind of putting out our results. It's not as bad as it sounds. That's not to say, there's this, when you say crisis, that's not, it assumes there's all this bad stuff going on. And I'm not saying this is not the case, but there is an issue with people not reproducing experiments and certain results never getting sort of mature, and we don't really have a way of assessing maturity or communicating maturity, and that becomes an issue in and of itself. So just the first issue that's going on, which may be if you're just blindly trusting the results of any science or science communication, this is one reason to at least be a little bit skeptical in the first place. The second issue has to do with the actual double-blind review process itself. Now, in theory, double-blind review is great. You get people looking at your work in your paper that don't know what your name is, and they're trying to evaluate the idea as objectively as possible. So it's a great idea in theory, but unfortunately in practice, the review quality is often poor. There's no quality control on good versus bad reviewers. Once again, no one's incentivized to write good reviews, even if they have to, because it's not helping them in their career or anything. It's just something you have to do, and it sucks, and no one wants to do it. So people aren't incentivized to give better reviews than others. There was this experiment in 2021 called the NeurIPS experiment, which was a replication, actually got replicated, of a 2014 NeurIPS experiment, where they basically resubmitted, they took all the papers that were in the conference and they resubmitted them for review. So they basically got set to two different committees, 10% of the papers. And 57% of all papers that were rejected by the first committee got accepted by the second randomly assigned community, right? So basically, people submit their paper, and in 10% of these papers, it got sent to two randomly selected committees rather than just one. So 57% of all the rejected papers were accepted by the other committee, and likewise, 57% of all the accepted papers were rejected by the other committee. So the conclusion of both of these experiments, which at arguably what is the top machine learning conference, NeurIPS, is that acceptances are basically arbitrary. What papers get accepted into the journal versus rejected is basically arbitrary. This is not a good thing. This is terrible, because this means what is supposed to be, reviewers are supposed to be the people that are part of the review process of deciding what is good experiments and what is not. If this is just random or basically arbitrary, it's not completely arbitrary, but it's essentially or basically arbitrary, for the essentially arbitrary. If reviewers, if other scientists in the community can't distinguish between quality papers and not quality papers, or good science and bad science, we have no right to ask the public to trust us as scientists the results of a certain journal versus results that got rejected from this journal, and it becomes a little bit issue. So the reason I bring this up is I think we can assume we can entrust the scientific method and the review process in theory. They're good ideas, and when they work correctly, they work really well. The question we're asking are current scientific institutions, which are journals, professors, these sorts of things, upholding these principles in a meaningful way. And once again, this is an issue that us in the scientific community have to address. This is not an issue that the public, it is unfair for us as researchers and scientists to ask the public for their trust if we can't even trust the results of our own institutions. Be very clear about this. And we cannot claim that the results that we say, the things we say, fit the standards, the rigors, the methodology of science until these issues are solved by us. And the other problem I see here is some of us feel the need to lie for science, and they do this for a moral term, which of course science can't make value judgments. But they act like these issues have been solved or that they will be solved. And that's not a good thing, because as soon as the public catches whiff of this, and as soon as somebody wants to expose these sorts of issues, the entire credibility of the scientific community and legitimate, peer-reviewed, independently verified science goes down, because people no longer know how to distinguish between what's good science and what's not as good a science, or science that just hasn't necessarily been subjected to these same sorts of things. So until we actually solve these, we need to be honest with the public and say, hey, this is very provisional. I mean, it's always provisional, but this is more provisional than other things, right? You can trust that Newton's laws generally give reasonably accurate results because we've tested this for the last several centuries, and that's fair. But the first time something new gets published, and then all the scientific science communicators go and do this, and they put some sort of implication, and they start honestly misleading the public, and then they have to backpedal if people change their minds. And we saw this with all the COVID stuff. It seems like there are these contradictory statements, and it gives people who are critical of science a reason to point at the scientific community and say, look, these guys don't know what they're talking about. And they do have a point if it was us as researchers making the claims that, oh, this is all of a sudden what it is, this is truth. We were making these sort of outlandish sort of claims, which most researchers understand, but not always is communicated to the public in an accurate way. And yeah, once again, I think science communicators and educators have a larger role here, and they have a responsibility to understand this, not to mislead the public, and understand philosophy and epistemology of science. So the answer, should we trust science less, or should you trust science less? I think the answer is kind of a yes and a no. The conclusion here is remain skeptical of results that haven't been subjected to multiple evaluations, and otherwise you kind of have to withhold judgment. You have to kind of be able to live with the uncertainty, or live in the mystery, as I think the Buddhists would say. And learn some philosophy of science as well, understand scientific realism, what some of the criticisms of that are, et cetera, and remain skeptical about any results that are peddled as science so you aren't misled. I mean, there are certain things you'll hear in a scientific journal that say scientists say this, and it's very clear that this is incompatible with the scientific method. So be careful when people use the word science in place of like truth as a sort of manipulative word as opposed to an actual descriptive or useful word. And understand that not every statement made by a scientist is an actual scientific statement or a statement of science. Or even necessarily a good statement. When scientists start making philosophical claims about metaphysics or about ethics and stuff, often, as Einstein said, the man of science is a poor philosopher, and it just doesn't work out very, very well. And understand that science isn't a monolith or even says anything. There's general scientific consensus, but then there are sometimes paradigm shifts where the scientific consensus completely changed. And we've seen this all the time with Galileo. We've seen this with Charles Darwin, these sorts of things. So these sort of paradigm shifts happen, and this is part of the scientific process, which part of the problem is, in some ways, yeah, you want to trust the experts to a certain degree, but also there are many cases where all the experts have been wrong. And part of that just means you need to understand it's not about the experts themselves agreeing, it's about their reasons for agreeing. And a lot of times when the experts agree on something, they have a very good reason for doing something, but you need to be able to evaluate those reasons and take those with, I guess, a grain of salt would be the things. And then just trust the results that have been established more strongly, more confidently, and put less trust in the things that have just been tried once, where it could have been a fluke, something like that, until you've had multiple tests. And then just some suggestions going forward, and this is mostly aimed at the people I know in the scientific community. Maybe one thing is moving away from this binary accept reject mentality and instead accept more of a workshop approach. So it's like rather than you submit a paper and it kind of arbitrarily gets accepted or rejected, instead say, okay, this is a great idea. In order for us to accept this paper, we would like you to do this and this and this and this and this experiment for us to really understand and be able to trust your claim. And I know there are some conferences in my field that are kind of going to this approach where you have rolling acceptances, not just deadlines, and you don't just get an accept or a reject. You sometimes will get, hey, like, can you run this experiment? You know, you're more in contact with the reviewers and it's more of an iterative process rather than sort of this this binary approach. And then, of course, financial or some other incentives for quality controlled reviews. We need some reason for reviews to be done well. Maybe one way is just you pay to submit your paper, you pay some money, and the reviewers get paid. And the reviewers that do a good job, they either get paid more or they get asked to come back. And people who do poor reviews, they either don't get paid, you know, something like this, some way that we incentivize people to have good reviews, because these reviewers are the gatekeepers between what gets published and what the public reads, what other people read. So we need some way to distinguish good versus bad methodology. And, you know, everyone responds to money or some other incentive. So that's one way you can look at this. There are probably other ones too. And then having incentives for researchers to publish and upload their data, and especially code, because code is the kind of thing, it's just, you can throw it on GitHub and it costs nothing. And now other people can see your results. Luckily, some of the biggest papers that I've seen, I have found bugs in code by people like Jeffrey Hinton. And if he didn't upload his code, I mean, you can imagine other people wouldn't even be able to spot errors. You know, the whole scientific community is supposed to be a community that helps each other, right? If someone uploads their code, if I upload my code, not only can other people help me by basically finding errors in my code that I would want to know about, but also other people can rerun my experiments and verify it very quickly, and then they're not spending their valuable time that is valuable to them and valuable to the whole scientific community trying to reproduce my results. Boom, they're able to reproduce it in 5 seconds, and now they can start iterating. So once again, it helps this progression of ideas and helps things move forward, as opposed to, you know, trying to follow someone's methodology and then there are all these holes and you don't know what they did. Especially with code, it's like, what did you actually do, and how do I know I can trust your results? If you don't provide the code, it's like you basically have to reconstruct their paper backwards from their paper and try to guess what code they're doing. And a lot of times it's very difficult to do. And then, you know, I think researchers just at least showing some solidarity about what is legit and calling out BS on all sides. This means calling out BS within the scientific community, like, hey, you guys are overstating the case for this, and these people are understating the case for this. I think more solidarity about this, less sort of infighting about this is going to help. And I think part of the problem here is we don't even have a good definition of what science is. There's a lot of other weird financial and funding incentives as well. But I think the more researchers can at least get behind showing some level of solidarity, the better things are going to be. And the less likely you're going to have these issues where, for instance, you have the neo-Darwinians and the intelligent design people in both of these camps throwing attacks on each other, saying you guys aren't doing science, and it just kind of hurts the public trust from all sides in the overall thing. Now, maybe that deserves to happen, but at the same time, that's the effect of what's kind of going on. And then the last thing is teach philosophy and critical thinking and epistemology to the public. Perhaps more important for the general public than understanding how to actually do science is how to be able to distinguish what is something that's peddled as science to like manipulate them, and what is something that is actually solid science. What are the kinds of questions science can answer? I mean, if people could understand like, oh, I read in this article that science said this, but I know this article is ridiculous because science would never do this or say this, or, you know, what experiment, you know, you go into the article and you say, no, there's no way this experiment, there could be other explanations for this. So that's kind of almost even more important than all of this, that underlines all of this, is people are using the word science because it has this sort of epistemic authority, but they're using it in a way that undermines the epistemic authority in the first place. And it kind of waters down the term science, where science just means stuff that people want you to believe, even if maybe some things that are called science are a lot more provisional. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm curious if you have any thoughts, put them in the comments. And hopefully those of us as researchers are going to do a better job of qualifying our claims and calling out bad science communication and things like that. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.